So hi everybody and welcome to ADAS's next lecture in the 2021 series with Hawkins Brown Architects. So tonight we'll be hearing from Campbell, James and Rebecca, who are going to be talking about their work in a variety of projects, mainly around London as well as Scotland. So after we hear from the team tonight, we can open up for some questions. So you can either type these into the chat or the Q&A where we can all see them. So if you want to turn your mic on to speak, just type that in the question as well and we'll be able to turn that on too. So before I pass you on, I'd like to say a bit about ADAS. We're a student-led society which aims to produce a range of lectures, workshops and social events to students in the wider architecture community. Although we can't be together in person this year, this hasn't stopped us, and we've had people join us from all over the UK to speak or listen to our lectures. So tonight I'm excited to get back on with an exciting programme with a relevant topic. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to, I think James is going to start us off tonight.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to give us an overview of the Agar Grove project that we've been working on for over the past 8 years, really, in Camden with the London Borough of Camden. So I don't know if any of you know some of the schemes that Camden developed in the 60s, but they're well known for being quite innovative and quite forward-looking in their developments. And this project is one of the first projects they've commissioned basically, as a sort of large-scale estate regeneration, in about 25 years. So it's really drawing on those kind of roots of heritage of innovation. So this is the master plan for the redevelopment. So the site at the moment is looking southeast at the moment. So there's a conservation area along the road, sort of the road that's running diagonally, and then a main train line on the eastern side, so on the left-hand side of your screen, and then an elevated railway running on the southern side of the site, so on the right-hand side of the screen. And because of this, the site's really cut off from surrounding streets. And if you go on to the next slide, Campbell. So you can see here, so that conservation area running along the north side. This is oriented north-south. And the problem that gives is that there's these strange sort of pockets as a lining to the street. Not really any definition. The big gate that runs around the outside of the estate, and it's really cut off from the surrounding streets. So in the bottom right-hand corner is a ball court and the main sort of play area in the estate, but no one really goes there because there's no one looking out over it. It's quite dangerous to go there. So if you go to the next slide. So at the moment, there's a lot of low-rise blocks that are essentially just a repetitive block typology. It's got no real connection to the ground, no real different relationship with the ground or active frontages. So, there's a lot of bedrooms at street level, and no one really able to look out with defensible space out onto the public areas. Also, the landscaping isn't really programmed because of that, to avoid having people walking really close to your ground floor windows. A lot of the landscaping is just buffer space. It's not really programmed for play or programmed for walking in. Just the next slide, please. The centre of the estate is there's a tower, which we're looking to retain. So as part of the process, we've been engaging with residents on the estate. So some stats on the right hand side. But I suppose the main thing to say about this is that Camden have been doing their own resident consultation. So often on schemes, you'll get an external consultant to run this consultation. But for purposes of accountability, I think Camden really were keen to do this themselves. And so our main client contact and then another person from the council were running all of the consultation sessions that we attended. And so you can see we've had 7 throughout the planning stage. We've had 30 with residents and statutory bodies, and over 475 interactions that have been logged and reacted to and incorporated into the design. And I suppose the whole point of this is that it's not been a sort of tokenistic way of doing this. So we've not taken a ready-made scheme and said, this is, what do you think of it? It's been designed in collaboration with the estate. And to demonstrate that we never had the tower at the centre of the estate as part of the development, and actually from the sort of perceived success from residents of the consultation that was going on around, they really wanted to get involved in the development, and now they are also involved. So sort of proof that if you meaningfully engage with people, then you can get a really good outcome. And that's sort of proved by the one letter of objection that we got, which the planners were saying was a completely unprecedented thing for a scheme of this size, of over sort of 500 homes. Go to the next slide, please. And so, as well as engaging, sort of with voting, and you can see sort of sticky notes on the presentation boards on the previous slide, and also making models as a way of communicating straightforwardly with local residents. So models at the scale of the whole estate, and then also models of individual homes. Next slide, please. So this was just to explain to residents how a typical 3-bed flat might look. So a 3-bed flat in the existing estate, and then the improvements that you would have with a flat that would be made to modern standards. So having some outdoor space, which none of the existing flats have, directly accessible from your living space, and then having a much bigger open plan living space and a much better connection from your main front door, not having that red space there is a kitchen that you have to escape through, which wouldn't be legal nowadays, to escape through your kitchen. But much more open plan, much larger area for your flat generally. Next slide, please. And so, as part of what we mentioned earlier of the sort of connecting to the streets around, the primary moves were to sort of link into the surrounding streets, so creating a street from the west. So you see the sort of street that, Campbell, have you got your mouse there? You see the street on the western side, the southwestern side, sort of creating a sort of loop around back up to the northeastern corner of the site, and then creating a new avenue from the middle of the site, from Agar Grove down into the centre of the site, into this, sort of giving a meaning to this tower, rather than it being sort of lost in this landscape of low-rise blocks. Got a road that goes to it, and you can navigate your way easily. And so it's really creating a hierarchy between streets, formal or more informal public squares. So the one on the eastern side is probably a bit more formal, and then the one on the left-hand side is slightly more informal, with a play area and Muga, and then sort of areas that are semi-private to the backs of blocks. And the architecture really just defines those edges and makes those really legible. So it's quite obvious what's public and what's semi-private, and then what is individual people's homes. Next slide, please. So as part of that, there were various different block typologies. So we were applying relevant block typologies where the context suited. So on the sort of on the northern side, sort of the right-hand side of this image, we've got the blocks that are closest to the conservation area. So the lining of that street is a series of villas, which match the sort of gauge and scale of the villas on the opposite side of the street. And then towards the back of the site, so on the left-hand side of the screen here is a tower, and obviously the surroundings to that are railway lines. So that scale is appropriate at the back of the site because it's furthest away from the conservation area, and and there isn't the direct context of low-rise buildings adjacent. And so, next slide, please. And so the phasing of the scheme was really important. So splitting this into phases to enable what Camden called a single-phase decant. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So that was basically promising all of the existing residents that they wouldn't have to move off the estate. They could remain in their homes and move once into their new home. You could watch it being built and move in. And that was really important to retain the existing community, but but also to allow basically to sort of double the density to pay for this. So because there wasn't the money from central government and Camden couldn't borrow indefinitely to pay for that, there were phases of private sale that have been introduced in order to pay for the social housing. So it's roughly a doubling of the density, so that the blue blocks are private sale blocks and the green blocks are social rented blocks. So sort of unlocking this puzzle was really key to enabling for that community to remain in place. And as I was saying earlier about the Lulworth Tower, the tower that's being retained, would have been really difficult to refurbish that with the residents still in place. And so the new tower that you can see at the back of the site has been built for those residents. And actually, through that resident consultation, potentially the perception of a tower or socially rented tower is that people don't want to actually live in towers. But the feedback that we were getting from all the residents was that they were the ones that had remained. They'd stayed there for a long time. People that didn't like living there had moved on and found other places to live. But the ones that remained really enjoyed living in a tower. And so it gave us a really strong argument to the planners to say, we can build a tower because it's appropriate in this context, but also all the residents that want to move into this really like living in a tower, and we're not just putting them in high-rise accommodation and not giving them any choice in that. So next slide, please. So yeah, this is just saying about the density that's required to achieve that sort of net zero cost to Camden in the sort of final condition. So when all the private sale housing is built, they won't have to borrow any money, or they can pay back everything that they've owed to build the social rented homes. And this is really possible because of the low density of the existing estate and the kind of unprogrammed landscape. So next slide, please. So these are some planning stage CGIs. So these are quite old. It's been, because of the phasing and the sort of single phase decan, it's been quite a slow process, but we're on the third phase now, and we're kind of up and running. And once those first two phases are complete, the second phase on the right hand side is almost complete. Once those are completed, all of the low-rise blocks on the estate will have been demolished, and everyone from those low-rise blocks will have been rehomed. So the rest of the development can really continue at pace. So this is a view from the refurbished tower on the right-hand side, looking back at the sort of triangular public square and play area, and then those first two phases, the first phase on the left-hand side and the second phase on the right. And then on the left-hand side, we've got a view from the western side of the site, looking at the first phase, back at the tower in the centre of the site, and then the new tower that the residents from that, the current residents from that tower are moving into in the centre of the image. Next slide, please. And so, as part of that, Camden really committed to providing really high quality interiors as well. So, going right the way from the district to doorknob, as we were calling it at sort of planning stage. So, really robust interiors, because they were going to retain the ownership of them. Even with the private sale homes, they were still the freeholder. So they had some responsibility to maintain the common areas, and so they were really interested in providing high quality materials and materials that wouldn't have to be maintained or needed as little maintenance as possible, and sort of learning the lessons from those projects from the 60s, which were probably beautiful for the first couple of years when they were first made, but required quite a lot of maintenance, and so suffered recently. So these are some early CGIs for the interiors of the various different tenured blocks. And then next slide, you can see how they ended up in reality. So we think they're pretty similar. We're pretty happy with the quality of the finishes. The next slide, please. And so it's coming on to talk about Passive House. So initially the project wasn't going to be a Passive House scheme. So I think this is probably something that we're finding on quite a lot of projects. where the client isn't completely sure that they want to go with Passive House. They need a bit of reassurance. And Camden had built a Passive House project before, but it caused lots of delays, and they were a bit unsure about applying it to such a huge development. And so it was really sort of after the initial design, so sort of old Reaper Stage C, that Passive House came in. So once the master plan was set and all the blocks were laid out. But I suppose what we would say now is that actually fixing that master plan and orienting those streets, connecting back into the surrounding streets, is probably more important than orienting the buildings optimally for Passive House. So typically you try and orient the buildings along a north-south axis and have as shorter east and west elevations as possible. But yeah, as you can see from the sort of existing estate, with those repetitive block types, that can create quite a hostile or a difficult to navigate public realm. And so we took the sort of typology of Passive House in the the kind of one-off houses and render and timber cladding, and realised the opportunities that you can have with Passive House when you apply that to a large-scale building. And we were saying that actually at this scale and in this context, sort of more heavyweight facade materials are appropriate. It's not appropriate to have render or timber. And so with the scale of the building, because the amount of external envelope is relatively lower for the footprint, we're able to have things like brick and GRC cladding. So next slide, please. So this is the first phase of the project, completed in 2018. And so this responds really well, actually, just by slightly by chance, shall we say, in terms of the way it was phased, but it works really well with Passive House. And so it was really good that it was the test bed for being the first phase. Also, that it worked really well with the orientation. But the reason it was deemed to be the first phase was because it involved demolishing the fewest number of homes. So going back to that single phase decant promise, it was what caused the least disruption and meant that no one had to be moved off the site. So in terms of the facades, they're very different. So the facade on the north is the left-hand side. It's very flat and has got relatively smaller windows. And so they're relatively smaller because they won't get as much sunlight. And so you actually need that sunlight to partially heat the space. So if you keep the windows relatively smaller, then you're not losing as much heat. And so in order to make those read slightly more generously than they would otherwise, we had a sort of panel. So if you can see on the left-hand side of that canopy, you can see a sort of slither of a panel. So the opening reads larger than the actual window is, and then that panel to the side of the window is insulated, so providing a slightly better performance than the window itself. But then on the right-hand side, there's a completely different facade, which is suitable for shading in the summer when you get excess solar gain. So when there's too much sun coming in, and obviously it's going to cause an issue with overheating in your flat. But then in the winter, when the sun is lower in the sky, the depth of that balcony means that you get that sun into your living spaces. Next slide, please. And so you can see that in the section of the building. So north facade on the left-hand side and southern facade on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. And so I suppose we'd say that this is probably over provision of amenity space. So typically it's talking sort of single figures of meters squared per flat, but actually potentially providing double that in some situations. But it's also providing a sort of function of shading as well as just the balcony space. And with a developer like Camden, it's something that is possible to do, because they take the sort of longer term view. Next slide, please. And so, in terms of solving the sort of issues with the existing estate of lack of active frontages and programmed streets, generally the whole of the ground floor is lined with masonettes where we have homes, with a sort of semi-private courtyard to the rear. So that typology is established here and used throughout the rest of the development. Next slide, please. And then on the typical upper floor, you can see the sort of relative change in depth of the facade on the north side, and then on the south side with the continuous balconies. And this is really possible through having the number of flats per core that we have. So on this floor, we've got 3 flats per core on both of the blocks, which with a commercial developer you wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve. But with the context, you can see the sort of the red line, the sort of edge of the site there. You probably wouldn't have been able to get a much larger block in there. But I think with a developer like Camden, they are open to doing things like this, and understand the benefit in terms of sort of dual aspect flats and cross ventilation and better daylighting. Next slide, please. And I was talking earlier about the sort of quality of those interior spaces. So this is a social rented block, but they've got a fully tiled communal entranceway, tiling on the outside of the entrance door, a view all the way through to the garden at the back of the entrance. Painted entrance doors and recessed mat wells, engineered timber flooring. And all of these kind of options, all these materials are only really possible because Camden see the benefit of investing, in the sort of long-term stewardship of the project. Next slide, please. And then just to kind of go back to these external balconies. So it gives a real opportunity for people to put furniture out there, to put plants out there, and to really use them as external rooms, like the family on the left-hand side have done. And actually, because the low-rise nature of the buildings to the south, have actually got really good views out over London. Next slide, please. And so this is the second phase. So the buildings on the left-hand side are the blocks which are sort of villas lining the street opposite the conservation area. And on the right-hand side is the first private rented block, private sale block. Next slide, please. And they're under construction now, and they're almost complete. Next slide, please. And then the third phase, we're doing detailed design on that now, and we should be starting on site in June this year. And so this is on the left-hand side, this is the private sale block. And so when we designed this in about 2013, around 8 years ago, this had the sort of strategy of having those duplex units at ground floor. But actually, because it was a private sale block, with the sort of surrounding developments, getting a sort of duplex 2-bed flat would have cost, to buy on the open market would cost a relatively large amount of money, to buying, say, a 3-story townhouse, sort of Georgian or Victorian townhouse, and with its own garden without any flats above. And so we were advised that would be relatively unaffordable. And so if this block has got to make back the money that the social housing is is costing, then it needs to be as efficient as possible in terms of sort of making that money back. And so these CGIs come from a sort of recent redesign to try and optimize that ground floor, and to move all of the wheelchair flats into the ground floor, but to retain some of the quality, or as much as possible of the quality of those duplexes and the sort of deep reveals and deep entrances at ground floor. Next slide, please. And as part of that exercise, sort of taking the lessons learned from the previous phases as well, we were trying to reduce the amount of thermal envelope. So previously, where we might have had a recessed balcony, so you see on the left-hand side, where that doesn't stack with the floors above or below, that's 26 square meters of envelope. So, and where it does stack with the floors below, it's 15. But actually, what we've managed to achieve is to have 6 square meters of envelope by having that as internalized amenity. And so the way that we achieved that was by creating a space that feels like it is an external room. It has tiling in the same way as you would on a balcony. It's got a different soffit material. It's not a plasterboard soffit. It's got an aluminium lined soffit. If you go on to the next slide, you can see what those will look like. So, this is a view from the living room. And then these are tiled, the sort of separation of material separation, but also it's kind of partition on the left-hand side. You can see, so when you walk in your flat, you'll get a view out through that partition and out into the courtyard here. But also the windows open, pretty much all the way. So to all intents and purposes, it feels as though it's an outdoor space, even though it's within the thermal line of the building. And we've managed to engineer this into the design, and it really helps in terms of the just sort of smoothing out the amount of external envelope that we've got and achieving passive house. You go to the next slide, please. And then the fourth phase, as I mentioned earlier, will be this tower in the sort of back corner of the site. And so the arch that you can see is a new community centre. And then the sort of podium of that tower on the left-hand side will be an office for the tenant management organisation. Go to the next slide, please. And the last phase of development will be stripping this tower back to its concrete frame, in a similar way to the project that we did at Park Hill a number of years ago. Next slide, please. But because none of that tower has any outdoor space, we need to add some additional area. And also all of the flats that within the tower currently are 1 and 2 bed flats, so an under area for current standards. So we need to add a little perimeter of extra floor space. So this the green zone, and then if you see on the plan on the top right, the blue zone will be winter gardens lining the whole of the outside of the building. And then next slide, please. I think that's me. Yeah, and then sorry, this is just a view of the back of the first phase, looking at the last phase of development. And I think we're on to Bex now. Yeah.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so I'm Rebecca, and I'm going to talk about Tigerway Hackney, which is in London, and we were working very closely with the London Borough of Hackney on this scheme. Next slide, please. So this was an education-led mixed-use school and residential project. The project helped deliver a new high-quality primary school with nursery and early years provision. And the scheme basically worked towards providing much-needed school spaces in Hackney. So this image you see here, the school is sort of sitting to the kind of south of the image on the sort of 2-story wings. And then the residential sits on the other side with a sort of slither, sort of shoulder terrace, and then the two towers popping up. Next slide, please. So the scheme provided 420 new places for pupils, as well as nursery and early years provision, and 89 new homes. Next slide, please. So the site was located in the northeast of London, well connected to public transport, and sat opposite a very generous green space called Hackney Downs Park. And to the north of the site, there was the Nightingale estate with a well-established community already in place. Next slide, please. So this scheme itself was part of a wider strategy. So we worked very closely with London Borough Hackney, which were sort of collaborated as a joint venture to make the local educational partnership. And the scheme delivered the school through the cross-funding model. So the sale of the units actually funded the school. And as you can kind of see this from this map, so our site's the sort of black dotted outline, but freeing up, so building this school enabled another school to be freed up to build another school, etc., and then eventually build up the spaces required within Hackney, which I think I've got 1,600 secondary school places were required. So ours was a primary school, but those two sites were then, are still ongoing, are providing the secondary spaces. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just talk about, so the scheme is quite complex, and the fact that Hawkins Brown has experience in multiple sectors came of a benefit here, because we have lots of residential experience and lots of school experience. So I thought I'd talk about sort of, I think, some of my personal sort of 8 points for designing a successful mixed-use scheme. There's lots of other little mini points, but I think these are just a few of the kind of key ones. Next slide, please. So some really important, so the scheme itself had to function independently. So to the north, which we have the school, and to the south, we have the residential. So it's trying to create a clear split between the two uses. And where you see that sort of dotted line going horizontally, that was sort of a physical split between the two, and allowing for ease of management and a very clear entrance strategy. As I mentioned earlier, this scheme was all, it was education-led. So it was about trying to give the best space and the most footprint to the school. So the school actually takes up 70% of the footprint to the north, and the residential uses the airspace effectively. So 30% of the ground floor footprint, and then pops up. Next slide, please. So this just shows the defined entrances. So the school, this is their main entrance here, the sort of green surround, and then they've got sort of along their north elevation, various kind of gates into the various play spaces. And then next slide, please. And then this is the entrance into the residential, sitting centrally there, into their main concierge space. And you can also see the sort of split in the character of the architecture as well. Next slide, please. Coherent development. So although this is two uses, we wanted to celebrate the fact that this is a really unique hybrid building and actually create unity. So the palette is a sort of terracotta cream palette. However, we sort of use different ways to kind of distinguish between the two sides in the architecture. Next slide, please. So yeah, so you can just see here, so it's having their own identity. So we provided a sort of playful green palette for the school side. Next slide, please. And then for the residential side, a more subtle, sophisticated palette, reflective of kind of some of the comments as well. We had a branding consultant, residential developer on board, and sort of working closely with them on the kind of palette for the residential scheme. Next slide. So designing for purpose. So it was a real challenge on this scheme to create an excellent learning environment combined with kind of high quality residential apartments, and trying to find that sort of happy ground or happy medium as such. So thinking about the positioning of buildings, management, access to play space, and a real aim from the client side and also the design team was to meet and exceed government guidelines. And actually by having the provision of the residential units as private sale to fund the school, we were able to give a far better sort of quality per square meter spendage rate. And we were able to sort of use the residential as the high quality they needed to also set the high quality required for the school. So I think as well, just to add to this design for purpose, I think it was really beneficial to this project that London Borough of Hackney brought on a residential stakeholder to support the design of this project, and both the residential and the school stakeholders sort of sat around the table with a clear understanding of everyone's ambitions. So it was really beneficial to that sort of design process. Next slide. I think talking about functional spaces, but remember, it's for children. Have fun, thinking about how this space can be special, create places for interaction, think about flexibility, remembering the user. So we actually work really closely with the children on this particular, you can see a sort of leafy mural, and it's the school's called Nightingale Primary, and it was as if they were the nightingales in the tree. And actually the children, we've carried out various workshops with them to develop this, which was really fun and created a sense of ownership over the building. Next slide, please. But also we had to think about these are places to live, so bright, flexible, and functionable. Next slide. And yeah, as I said, flexibility. Next slide. To suit different lifestyles. So marketability was really important to ensure the school could happen. So working with the residential stakeholders to think about those different lifestyles that Londoners of all types require and request. So building that flexibility was very important. Next slide. High quality environments. This sort of tied into design for purpose, but well-being was at the centre of the scheme. So light, bright spaces with high ceilings. We looked at, so the massing was designed in a way that we could utilise passive ventilation. We also have sort of chimneys within that encourage passive ventilation. We thought about thermal mass and views out as well. So wherever you are in the school, there was always a view out, and the same with the residential, which was a real sort of challenge on a tight urban site. And we actually achieved BREEAM Outstanding on the school-based stages, which the team were very proud of. This is actually the park room, which punches through underneath the residential out towards the park. So the school's actually facing on the other side, but we thought it was important that there was a connection to nature and a view to that park. Next slide, please. Just naturally lit environments is just an example in the school hall. Next slide, yeah. Making places that people want to live, well-designed features, aspects. We had our in-house interiors team picking up on this, and it just adds a level of sort of tangibility to the scheme. Next slide, please. And then just thinking about various finishes and how you can, there's a balance between creating individuality in the flats, but also repetition. So that you've got to get that sort of idea of sort of standardization, but something special as well. And it's a real challenge in big residential schemes. Next slide, please. Consideration to overlooking. So this is one of the biggest things that kept coming up, the idea of residential above a school. Are we going to have residents overlooking the school? How does this work? Blah, blah, blah. So a few things we had to think about were where we positioned views. So we've actually got on this image, you can see some of the lower windows have a kind of higher kind of transom, but also where we have balconies, they always sat to the side of the towers overlooking the park or east to west. Thinking about the uses that sat at the lower levels of the towers. So we actually have sort of yoga rooms and things like that sitting on the lower bits. And then actually setting a datum. So 3 stories up from the play space, you're actually the same distance as if you were across the road. So we sort of explained it in that way. And actually having that coherent palette actually makes, the head teacher says, you don't even notice the residentials above you. So anyway, I'll move on because of time. Yeah, so focusing amenity away from the school. This is the communal residential space. Next slide. And as I mentioned, private amenity and balconies were always facing away and overlooking the park or east-west. Next slide, please. It was really important to think about designing inside and out. So as I mentioned, it was a very tight urban site. So access to outdoor space, utilizing roof spaces and horizontal planes for play spaces and landscapes. Next slide, please. With well-being being at the center. So thinking about the quality of the sort of landscaping. So we've got that this is a growing space with we've got beehives up there. So just thinking about the variety. So it's about quality rather than quantity. Next slide, please. And also places for residents. So on the left is the communal space, but on the right we have private gardens that face out onto the street. And actually the sort of tiling and the sort of more smaller scale reflects some of the existing buildings around the park, but just adds a sort of humane scale to this quite large scheme. Next slide, please. And viability was key. So I mentioned the balance between the amount of residential to make the school viable, and the tower provided the most efficient way of providing the amount of units we required to make the school happen. And as I mentioned earlier as well, having those residential stakeholders on board as part of the team early on to sort of help steer the brief was really beneficial to ensure the scheme was marketable. And actually 100% of the flats sold very quickly, which was really great. Next slide. And just thinking about how these spaces are welcoming. So on the left, we have the concierge space, and on the left, the school space. Next slide. I'll go quickly. And also, we had as well as a sort of external coherent palette, we always thought about a shared interior vision. So I mentioned the sort of nightingales on the school side, but actually that translated into a more sort of sophisticated version of a sort of forest with that wall, feature wall you can see there, but also the way the paneling and the joinery worked within that space. So just to finish very quickly, I just wanted to talk about some key advantages. So we were able to deliver a school sort of above quality, above its typical sort of government funding availability, really. So it was 3,500 per square meter. It's usually far less than that. So also we were able to use I talked about enhanced energy efficiency. We're actually able to utilize the roof of the residential schemes to provide renewables for the school. So something really interesting in hybrid buildings is you can utilize the different planes to provide renewables and thinking about the energy holistically. And I think this really encouraged innovative design and a really interesting community building. And I think it's a really efficient use of land where we're dealing with cities and tight urban spaces. And I'm going to finish on that and pass over to Campbell. Thank you.
Right, unmute myself. Cool. Hello, so I'm Campbell. I'm going to take you through a couple of projects, but I'm going to start with one of the projects I've been working on most recently, which is a social housing project in southwest London, which is a regeneration of the Peabody estate in Wandsworth. So this is just kind of a quick overview of the site. This kind of shows what is the 9 new blocks which constitute the redeveloped site. So we've got plot 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, kind of going up the side, plot 9, plot 2, plot 3. And it's kind of like it was split into 3 phases. So the first phase, which was these 3 buildings on the left-hand side, the second phase, which is on site at the minute, which are these 3 buildings in the middle, and the third phase, which is due to start 2023. So as a bit of background, so if you're not familiar with this guy, this is George Peabody. So he founded the Peabody Trust in 1862 with the purpose being to try and provide high quality model dwellings for London's poor. When there was a real focus on providing like robust materials, kind of quality social space, amenity space, sort of in and around the kind of the housing. This is the existing Peabody estate as it was when we started designing this scheme way back in 2008. And you can kind of see that there's kind of quite a rational series of building blocks, kind of quite repetitive. They kind of are just laid out around a few central squares. Like there's one key central square in the middle. There's kind of a main railway line. That's kind of one of the main access routes or our kind of arterial routes that goes into Clapham Junction Station, which is just here to the top of the screen. And there were a number of kind of problems that we kind of picked out from the existing estate that we kind of wanted to respond to in our new design. So one of the interesting things about this kind of area is, some of the high quality existing buildings in the surrounding area. I'll speak through this a bit, but this kind of like picks out some of the problems with the estate as we kind of, as both the client Peabody were aware, but we kind of helped them to kind of like get better understanding as to how we could improve things based on an analysis of the existing estate. So top left, you can kind of like say it's quite nice that there's this existing amenity space in the surrounding area, but it wasn't particularly high quality. It was just grass. And so there was trying to explore ways of providing good quality amenity space within the estate itself. You can see bottom left-hand side that The quality of the amenity space within the estate itself was pretty poor. It's just tarmacked, hard landscaping with, it doesn't necessarily look like somewhere you'd want to play, although that was the play space for the residents. The top right-hand image just sort of shows, this quite a significant railway line abutting the site and the western elevations. So that is kind of quite a key constraint that we needed to work around. And then on the bottom right-hand image shows what was the surrounding kind of boundary wall to the estate. It looks more like a kind of a garrison for kind of a military barracks rather than a social housing estate. And one of the key things that we picked up on is that the materials were quite hard, but also that the estate had really turned its back on the local community. And one of the key challenges was, how do we actually create a new scheme that is better connected to the surrounding area, both aesthetically, but also in terms of uses and in terms of the kind of the language of the streets and the building forms. This just shows a little bit more detail about what the original Peabody estate kind of layout was like. And it was 353 units in the existing estate with kind of a community centre, but with a lot of kind of surface parking and sort of like poor quality kind of surfaces in the amenity spaces. But one of the really nice things was that despite, because of the existing buildings kind of reaching the end of their lives and needing to be replaced, it's like there was still, it had been finished pre-war, and there was still residents living on the estate who had been born there. And so there was people who had been born and brought up in these buildings, and there was a real sense of community and a real sense of identity for the residents who lived there. And Peabody, so our client, did not want to, they wanted to try and redevelop the estate whilst maintaining that sense of community and identity. And that's kind of a real challenge. And that kind of led, similar to Agar, to the phasing strategy for the scheme. But as you'll see later on in the presentation, some of the ornamentation and kind of detail of the buildings. So in broad master planning terms, when we're talking about how did we analyze this problem and how do we respond to it, we were sort of saying, well, on the left-hand side, the existing estate was very, you had this very large, significant boundary wall that kind of turned its back on the surrounding streetscape. And the buildings kind of like didn't really seem to sit very comfortably in and around the surrounding Edwardian buildings. So the first thing we thought was, well, okay, let's get rid of the boundary wall. Let's try and sort of turn the layouts of the estate inside out, so it's more outward looking, more integrated into the community outside of the estate. It's like, and let's use that as a kind of launching point to then start beginning to look at building massing, street layouts, and so on. So this was the existing estate in 3D. So first step, which was part of the brief, was level it, kind of get rid of everything. That sounds like quite a whimsical kind of throwaway line, but that came off of the back of a lot of detailed analysis of the existing estate, the quality of the housing stock, and sort of surveys and sort of research carried out with the community. Look at where can we actually position new kind of routes through the site, so set of the key streets, which can help to integrate it more into the existing streetscape and the surrounding access routes. So on the bottom left-hand side, we kind of created this kind of main avenue that kind of goes northwest, basically that connects this park on the bottom to the railway station at the top, which can then become a main access point for people to the southwest of the site. We keep a central square. That's the kind of the square that was already existing in the estate, but that becomes like a focal point for any new development, but still kind of ties it into some of the kind of the language or form of the existing development. Try and deal with the kind of noise produced by the railway line to try and shield and protect this amenity space, the new social kind of heart of the development, from what's quite a disruptive railway line to the west. Try and close off what looked like a kind of a broken urban block by kind of creating this new L piece that both helps to define the kind of the streets that we're creating in the new estate, but also closes off what's kind of like a broken urban block and creates a new amenity space that's kind of semi-private in the center of this block. A new central focal point, a focal building on the center of the scheme. So this would be where we provide a community center. And in the scheme as it kind of developed later on, this is a older person's social rent block. So for later living, which has got a series of kind of amenity spaces for older persons. And then a series of kind of courtyard blocks which basically were providing kind of a semi-private kind of form of amenity and social space. So you had these streets which were providing kind of publicly accessible areas, a new public amenity space in the center that was faced onto by the community center that was activated by the buildings around it. And then you had semi-private amenity and social space which was accessible via courtyards, and then defensible space around the blocks through like private gardens. And then there was this, we wanted to try and make it so that the language of the estate was that each building kind of was of a similar kind of palette of materials, but each had their own kind of unique identity. So this is just diagrammatically representing that. And this kind of translated into this artist's impression of the estate when it will be completed. And then at the end of all of that, we will have 600 homes. So we'll have almost doubled the capacity of the site, similar to both Beck's and James's presentations. So kind of like this, the kind of key idea was using a few private sale units across the estate to cross-subsidize the new and improved social rent units, whilst also then providing improved amenity space and community facilities in the community centre. I'm aware of time, so I'll quickly go through these. These are basically just photos of each phase. So this is first phase. So this is it as was completed in 2016. So on the ground floor, we've got a series of duplex units with defensible space, which kind of like helps to kind of like make the buildings meet the ground in a slightly more considered way, but also then kind of helps to provide a kind of secondary boundary between the street and people's homes. Just details of the brickworks with some of the brickwork with some of the projecting balconies. Each access area for the residents had their own kind of identity. So we used like glazed brick as a way to try and help people identify with where their home was within each area of the estate. So we took inspiration through some of the Edwardian motifs on the surrounding buildings to form patterned gateways and create ornamentation in the estate. And we were using brick as kind of like quite a sort of humble and robust material, but by creating ornamentation through simply detailing the way in which it was laid in very specific ways. But you end up with what's quite a cost-effective, but quite a kind of a decorative finish in quite a simple material. Phase 2 is currently on site at the minute, so this kind of gives you an idea of what I was talking about before, with quite how imposing and unapproachable and closed off the estate was prior to its demolition and regeneration. So that's what it originally looked like on. This is what it will look like when it's complete. So this is plot 9. So that was the eastern courtyard block. And this is, again, a series of duplexes that go all the way around the bottom of the building. On the right-hand side, you see that there is a lower block, which is addressing a conservation area to the other side of the street. And setbacks and cutbacks and terraces and recessed balconies to try and provide a more high-quality kind of design, which is more in keeping with what the planners were looking for, given its proximity to the conservation area. And it also, these are social rent units, and because Peabody is a registered social landlord, they want to try and create a long-term asset that they can be proud of and they can continue to look after with Agar Grove, kind of like as little maintenance, ongoing maintenance as possible. This is where it currently is, so frame topped out pre-Christmas. This is another view. I've got 2 minutes. So this is then another view looking at the lower block on that building on plot 9. So you see we're kind of addressing the scale and the kind of language of the buildings and the conservation area to the left-hand side of the image. And for social housing, the quality of finish is really quite high. You know, we've got GRC, we've got precast concrete banding, we've got decorative brickwork. You know, it's something which Peabody have really invested in, really high quality housing. And you can kind of, if the first phase is anything to go by, is like the residents, when they get rehoused into the second phase, will be extremely happy with hopefully what they end up with. So this is then a picture of the central courtyard. So this is the community centre on the right-hand side with the kind of the breezeway and the windows, and that opens out to the central courtyard with the kind of existing trees from the original estate in the centre of it, and so the buildings facing the railway line in the background. Now those have to be large simply because that's what the scale that they need to be in order to try and provide an actual acoustic barrier to the railway line on the opposing side. This is plot 6, which was on the railway side. So this was topped out again before Christmas. This is plot 2. So this is the community centre, the bottom 2 floors. It's like with the older person social rent above. There's also a band of amenity space with a recessed terrace. So sort of like communal facilities for older people who may be less mobile, who are for them to get into the areas outside of the estate is maybe more challenging. So Peabody are providing more facilities right within the building that they're going to be living in. And so this was a picture of it then topped out again pre-Christmas. And this is just a kind of an artist's impression of what some of these shared amenity spaces within the older person's extra care areas will be like. So we've got kind of kitchenettes, and we've got library spaces, and almost like communal living areas where residents will be able to hang out with each other. Right, quickly. One of the key ways in which the residents were consulted and their aspirations and kind of identity brought into the redevelopment was is through artwork and ornamentation. So on the left-hand image shows the central square, which was in the original estate and has been carried over into the new one during the Second World War. So the whole kind of Second World War Dig for Victory campaign, the existing residents turned their central square into an allotment. And as I was saying, some of the residents were there during that time. It's like, and are still living there now. And so there was part of the community consultation was to try and identify key objects that they felt kind of captured their identity. And so these are, these are on the right-hand side, kind of pitchforks and shovels from that reminded them of the Dig for Victory and the community spaces, and the allotments in the community space. And this was all formed in brickwork by a Bristolian artist, which then gets laid into the brickwork by hand. So these are another bits of brickwork that were other symbols that kind of like being given to us by the residents, talking about kind of the pinafores, which were then built into brickwork, or workers' jackets, which again were then built into the brickwork. They kind of like they were small elements around the scheme, but when they were actually built into the brickwork, they're kind of these little moments of kind of like joy that kind of help the residents really feel like this is a place that they belong to. It's like this is something that they have ownership of, and they've helped to mold and shape. And second phase is going to be even bigger. So this is going to be what the front of the community centre looks like, which is a little bit bonkers. But we think it's going to be really impressive. I think whenever you view a visual, it looks significantly more. The contrast is a lot higher than it would be like in real life. It's going to be more blended into the brickwork, and so this the artists working away and beginning to create kind of mock-ups with the artwork. The final fired bricks being on site in 4 or 5 months' time to then be laid by hand. It's like into the facade. Now that was Peabody. I'm going to very quickly talk about ECA and one of the other projects from our Studio Scotland. So in case anyone doesn't know, Hawkins Brown does have a presence in Studio Scotland. We created an office here about 2 years ago on the back of winning 2 key jobs, one for Glasgow University and the other one for ECA. I'm going to go on just there's only a couple of slides. And one of those projects was Edinburgh College of Arts. So we had been this project was about kind of bringing together 5 schools of the Edinburgh College of Art onto the Lauriston campus. So that's kind of this area on the left-hand side. It's like currently they're spread across sort of different locations across central Edinburgh, and by bringing them all together, the kind of the hope by the university was that it would lead to more kind of like interdisciplinary and collaborative teaching. So both from that would work from a teaching perspective, but also by everyone being combined in the same building, it might lead to more collaboration through research or through through learning. So this kind of ties into the wider ambitions of the university, with kind of like the building or the new campus acting as like a Western kind of like gateway into this innovation corridor that kind of starts on the western end of kind of like Lauriston Place and going east all the way across to the edge of kind of the quarter mile. Another quick project that we did was the Granton waterfront kind of like envisioning kind of project. So one of the things that we were commissioned by the Scottish Futures Trust in Architecture Design Scotland to illustrate what a vision for Granton waterfront learning would look like. It's about the kind of principle was about enhancing a large master plan by considering a kind of a network of learning opportunities, like for the communities they serve. So this was just illustrating how graphically how a master plan doesn't necessarily have to be a slightly inaccessible kind of architectural drawing of a plan. It can be quite playful and quite fun and quite illustrative, and a way of engaging residents in the community in what kind of facilities they might have access to. It's like, so, you know, we've got things like we're providing sports academies, we're providing kind of like redeveloped like walled gardens, or kind of what facilities might they have access to. And we thought this was kind of like quite a good way of illustrating, and this was responded to quite well by the client. And so this is that's me. I have 5 minutes over. I'm very sorry.
Thank you so much, guys. That was brilliant. So we'll open up to some questions just now. I don't know if people want to start typing them. You can either put it into the chat function, or there's the Q&A function as well. Rebecca's had to drop out tonight, but
yeah, thank you everyone. Sorry I have to go, but any questions, if you just put them to Glenn, and I'm sure I can answer on email. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming along.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah, so if you just want to fire the questions into the Q&A or the chat, and the guys can answer them. If there's anything that's sort of more directed towards the Tiger Way scheme as well, we'll be able to send them over to Rebecca and get them back via email if the boys can't answer. So just to sort of start off, you mentioned about the Tiger Grove scheme, how it was like an isolated site. Was there any potential benefits to that, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose there's some benefits in terms of it being able to, I guess, having that tower in the sort of back corner of the site, whereas if there were more sensitive, Victorian sort of terrace housing in close proximity to it, then that would have been obviously quite inappropriate to have a tower there. But considering its proximity to the sort of King's Cross regeneration scheme, which is just over the other side of the tracks, actually sort of gave us the not immediate context, but fairly close context for that. And then there's a sort of large strip of industrial warehouses which are being looked at the moment for regeneration, and we imagine they will be regenerated in a similar way to a similar sort of scale. And so I guess that was trying to be contextual to that, to what we saw coming in that area eventually. But yeah, I definitely agree. It helped us to have a place for that tower, and to enable, because originally that those residents weren't included or as part of the original brief, those residents weren't going to be rehoused, and so it enabled us to have a place for that tower, and also for a community centre. So really activating that back corner of the site with something that lots of people would go to, and drawing people right into the estate rather than it being something that's quite closed off.
Yeah. Sort of going on from that, we've had a question coming from Lucy. She was saying, you mentioned Aga Grove is the largest passive house development in the UK. Do you think passive house is the future of residential design?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's definitely the future of residential design, and not just residential. It's really applicable to other building types. It's actually more straightforward with other building types, with primary schools or school spaces that are larger and less cellular than individual bedrooms and living spaces like you've got in residential. It's actually more straightforward. But yeah, I think it's trying to get it to a point where it's straightforward for everyone to build to passive house standards and to get the sort of quality of building on site, the actual construction quality. But I think that relies on us getting to a point where it's simple enough for people to understand, because I guess the sort of history of it is that it's this kind of German boffins with their spreadsheets, and the reality is that that's not really achievable for the vast majority of schemes. So if we can get it to a place where it's commonplace, it's kind of straightforward for people to understand, but both contractors and also consultants, it's been a real learning curve for us, then it is something that will be adopted. But I think whatever it stays, and things are changing, but whatever it is, it's got this kind of association with being very tech heavy and very difficult to understand, and its adoption is going to be limited. But I think things are definitely changing.
I think it is the future of residential design, as with kind of like most kind of like building types, as kind of James has said. I think the problem is going to be legislative and trying to get people to actually do it. I think there's probably not enough evidence for clients to necessarily want to invest in private for sale flats, because it's not necessarily translated into market value, or no one really knows how much additional you could sell a passive house scheme for. So whereas if it's not legislative, if somebody doesn't tell them they have to do it, what's their motivation to do it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think, like the two schemes we were presenting, you can see the types of clients that we have, housing associations and local authorities. They're the people that are coming to us at the moment, and they're the people who are developing passive house schemes because they retain the ownership. And like Campbell said, until it can be demonstrated that it's got that sort of tangible additional value to it, for private sale, it's not going to become completely mainstream.
Yeah. There are positive things to take away from it, though. I think there's a review of the kind of the energy efficiency guidance in building regs at the minute in England, and they're having to adopt more kind of stringent energy standards to try and meet the government's targets for carbon reduction and kind of like getting close to net zero carbon. And the reality is that the industry is just not really set up to trying to meet those targets that they're trying to put into legislation. And so there's going to be a massive learning curve that needs to be done by both contractors, consultants, and just the industry generally to be able to meet these standards. And passive house is one of those few ways of actually doing it.
I think that's the thing. It's the gap between what's designed on paper and what is built in reality, and not just in terms of quality, but actually kind of measuring that tangibly. And the problem with the vast majority of schemes is that you could design it on paper, and the performance gap is absolutely enormous because you don't have to test it in the same way. And so you just don't know what you're actually achieving. Yeah. Whereas you are having to pay for that testing, you're having to pay for that really thorough process of modelling, thermal modelling and thermal bridge modelling at a design stage that you wouldn't have to do ordinarily. And it is incredibly rigorous, but you actually know what you're achieving. And I think there are some say that passive house isn't, it isn't all expense. There is saving in the amount of energy that you use, therefore the amount of M&E kit that you're needing to provide. For this estate, we would have needed to provide a CHP, like a combined heat and power district heating system, which we didn't need to build an energy centre for this estate because we just said we're using less energy in the first place. And then ventilation units and triple glazing, because we're next to a railway line, we would have needed to provide those anyway. And so that additional cost that you have for that, if you need to provide it anyway based on the context, then obviously it's not such a large cost.
Yeah. Sort of keeping along that sort of same theme of passive house. So Jay's had a question that came in. What are some of the key design elements we should strive for to achieve and focus on when initially starting the design process? So the sort of key moves that would help keep that passive house theme from the sort of paper design stages.
Just as a quick aside, which I think provide context to that, do people know what passive house actually means? It's like passive house as a building is basically you just calculate all the energy that goes into a building and all the energy that comes out of a building, and you try and make sure that it's at a very low level that's required to heat the project. It's like, and that's basically it. It's like in the way. So what that means by necessity is that you end up having to design really, really thermally efficient buildings, and you have to be very thoughtful about where your solar gains come from. So where are your windows and how big are they? So in terms of like the general design principles, it comes from an understanding that passive house is about trying to just calculate where your heat comes from. It's like, and where your energy is going out of the building. It's like, so if you get that, then it's basically, you need south facing kind of like windows. It's like, but you need to be careful about overheating in the summer. It's like, and then you need to just make a really airtight and thermally performant building. It's like, and that's, I mean, James, you probably can answer better than I can, but that's kind of like that's more or less it. You kind of have to plug in the information into these design tools to double check whether you're actually meeting the standards or not. But it's quite a process to get there. But the principles are quite straightforward. Design a building as you would any other building. It's like you just need to be very careful about how much glass you put where and how big your walls are.
Yeah, exactly. I think actually, if the slide that I had on the solarium is like where we've sort of taken those lessons from the first couple of phases, and you're just actually thinking about how much external envelope you have by pushing in a recessed balcony. You've got 5 exposed sides versus 1 if we have the solarium. And I think if you take that and apply that to the larger scale of the building, having buildings that are kind of stepping in places, and therefore have a large thermal envelope, are going to be really tricky to achieve passive house. I mean, that's not to say you can't. It's just it's a trade-off. There's almost nothing that you have to do to achieve passive house. It's just how much cost is it? How much cost is it going to be, and what are the trade-offs going to be? Are you going to have very small windows? You're going to have a really thick roof build-up. You're going to have a thick external wall with lots of insulation. So, yeah, I think that the principles of orientation are really important. Glazing size is really important. Thermally bridge-free detailing, so continuity of insulation is really important. But with projects of this scale, you can have heavyweight materials like concrete, GRC, and brick cladding, which at a smaller scale, where passive houses come from, one-off houses, you just can't do.
So another question that's came in, sort of along sort of the same theme, is about retrofit though. So, is the retrofit approach ever considered when at the beginning of a redevelopment project? Potentially more angled at the Peabody estate, yeah.
Yeah, from our perspective, yeah, it's always the first thing we look at. It's like you don't just go in and analyze a site and go, right, let's just take everything down. You look at it and you have to have quite a kind of, you don't want to just preserve something for the sake of preserving it, but you need to so you need to be quite critical as to where the actual value in the existing buildings are and whether they're going to be fit for purpose and whether you can even properly refurbish them into what to kind of meet the client's aspirations. It's like, so we talk about passive house and we talk about energy efficiency. We need to get better at retrofitting buildings. It's like, and we need to get better at improving the thermal efficiency and reusing existing buildings. But it may just be a product of what we've shown tonight. But the existing buildings on the estates were of such a quality and build quality, and sort of that they reached the end of their lives. It's like they were not. Both the client had agreed and we agreed, and like when you did the surveys of the buildings, that there were significant issues. That by trying to retrofit them, you'd just be compounding the problem. And I think there is a tipping point when you go. You're going to invest so much in trying to preserve a building that's flawed that actually you end up spending more money and it being worse for the environment than just taking it down and starting again.
Yeah. And I think there are projects that we have done, like Park Hill, where demonstrated that it is possible, and where the building sort of massing and type is really good to start off with, and there are other things that are wrong with it, but the kind of bones of it are really good. It is worth stripping it back to its concrete frame and refitting it. But I think what I'm really interested in is how we get beyond that, and whether we can do anything more than just stripping it back to its frame. How much more can you keep? Because obviously there's a massive carbon saving in keeping the frame. It's probably the biggest carbon saving. But what about all the brickwork that's on the building? What about all the windows? How do you recycle all of that?
There's also other considerations. Like the population's growing. Like we need, there are schemes which need, especially in urban areas like London, to be densified. Like there's not enough housing available. It's like, and the social housing waiting lists to get longer and longer. People need to be provided social housing, and you have these sites that are owned by local councils where they're left with buildings from the 1930s that they can't actually. The only way of adding more homes to meet the social housing demand is to demolish them and build more homes.
So sort of on the opposite of that, almost, Elliot's asked if the residents had not shown interest in maintaining the tower, was there an alternative strategy in place for achieving the desired density, or was this a decision made after the consultation?
Keep retaining the existing tower?
Yeah.
I suppose the need to provide those new homes for the residents, and that was the driving principle really, and not moving anyone off the estate. I suppose and that promise was made to residents of all the low-rise buildings. And I suppose had Camden originally considered that the tower would be included, then potentially they wouldn't have been able to make that promise, because rehousing all the residents from the tower would have been very difficult without providing a new tower. But it was something that was purely born out of the consultation. I mean, in some ways, it's fortunate that the residents that were there did enjoy still living in a tower. But I suppose in a similar vein to Campbell was saying, a lot of those residents that were in the tower are still in the tower because it's not been refurbished yet. Their original estate residents, their kids have moved away. They've stayed on the estate, but they've moved into the tower because the tower is 1 and 2 bedroom flats, and they are sort of hardcore of the estate. It's the last phase that's going to be regenerated, and they keep saying, when are you going to get to our phase? When are you going to build this? but they understand that it's necessary to keep the community together.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose there would have been other options had Camden considered that tower being included right from the start of the project.
Yeah. As a more sort of generic question on the sort of housing, do you notice notice any different difference in the quality between the social housing propping up in London compared to the rest of the UK?
I suppose the land values are what drives everything, right? Like these three schemes are possible because, it's land that's owned by either it's owned by the developer to start off with, so they're able to not have a profit margin in the same way. They haven't got to go out and buy the site, but also the return on investment is not guaranteed completely, but it's safer than other parts of the country. And actually, our design manager was, she's American, but she was laughing and saying she feels like such a Londoner because there was a local authority that came to her who was looking and saying, well, we want to do a similar development to Agar Grove, want to do some passive house projects and want to get some new build social rented housing. And she was saying, oh, no, how big is the estate that you're building? And she was saying, oh, it's 3 homes. And the kind of budget for housing regeneration in other parts of the country is really, really low, because the sales values aren't there in the same way, and all of this is because local authorities can't borrow money in the same way to build. The only reason that they can afford to do it in London is because they can sell new homes to pay for it. They're allowed. Sorry, go Campbell.
No, I was going to say, I think that just goes on to what the second question in the Q&A is, which is, or how do you feel about the need for Council of London to integrate housing on the market to be able to afford, new social housing or new public buildings? And that, I think is my personal opinion is, I think is a real failure of the government to actually be able to provide sufficient investment to be able to build social housing. It's like the fact that you have to essentially sell off leaseholds of public land to be able to fund social housing, I think is a real problem, because it basically means that then that area of what should be publicly owned land is then wrapped up in leasehold agreements for the duration of the lease. It's like, and then you can't as a freeholder, you then can't reasonably deny an extension to a leaseholder. So essentially that, beyond the revenue you get, it's like from what do they call it? Not land taxes. You know what I'm saying, James? What's the phrase? When you have to
capital and rent.
Yeah, so yeah, that's it. Land rent. Thank you. Land rent and service charges. It's like beyond the revenue that the freeholder gets from those things, it's like it basically means that they have limited their future possibilities to redevelop that estate, in 50, 100 years' time. And it's something which I think is really short-sighted in my view.
I mean, that kind of goes back to one of the questions we had earlier about why some of these projects aren't considered they are considered but aren't able to be redeveloped. And I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that they have been, where there are leaseholders, it's really difficult to buy those. It's really expensive and really difficult to buy those leaseholders out. You've got to loan the money to do it, but then also, how do you create a market value how do you work out what a market value is for that? When the market value is massively depressed by the fact that they know it's going to be likely to be demolished, and so how do you create something that's fair? And so, all the leaseholders on this estate have been offered shared ownership homes on the estate, but I think that's the best that Camden could afford. But it's all because there's no money from central government.
I'll have one more question before we sort of wrap up tonight. So is a learning neighbourhood representing a collaboration between the listed entities, or is it a vision of how learning can extend from school buildings into the city? Don't know if I've read that properly, but if you click on the Q&A, you'll be able to see it yourselves.
Which project are we talking about?
Tiger Way, I think.
The Tiger Way.
I think so.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that one for you. I'm not particularly au fait with Tiger Way, I'm afraid.
No, same. I think that's the one for Bex.
Well, I'll be able to copy that question and send it over to her by an email. So we'll CC you into the email and get that back to you, Michelle. Perfect. So got one last question for myself then. So do you think there's any key elements within your outdoor spaces that help activate it? You mentioned a lot of sort of courtyard typologies within the schemes. Was there any sort of key elements within them that helped to activate them?
I think just having things that open onto them. It might sound really basic, but you need to have reasons for people to move through them, to go move around them, and then to actually use the spaces and access things off them. And you need elements like natural surveillance and people to look at them so that when people are using the spaces, they feel safe. And I think that however you design spaces, like you need to consider kind of like how they're positioned makes them suitable for the use that you intend to go there. So for instance, the central square we've got in Peabody, it's like it was an appropriate place to put it, both because it was the historical location for it, but also we then stuck a load of buildings on it on the western flank. So then acoustically, it's kind of appropriate for the use that's going on to it. The community centre opens onto it, that activates it. I think it's those sorts of things about making sure that enough is going on in and around the spaces. If you just dump a space somewhere in a scheme and go, don't worry, that's amenity space, and there's nothing really, it's not really integrated into the buildings that you're designing, it's going to be left over and people will use it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think I completely agree. That's why the amenity space that is in Agar Grave at the moment is completely unused. Well, not completely, but it's dangerous to use because there isn't really anyone looking out over it. And I think getting that streetscape right is really, really tricky because, you want people to feel safe in their homes. You want people to not be looked in from the street. But you also want them to be able to look out and kind of see what's going on in the street. So I think thinking about how your kitchen works at ground floor is really important. That is a way of getting a sort of defensible position. Having your kitchen sink, sort of standing there, in a defensible position, where you've got something that's kind of up to sort of waist height, and you're looking out over the street, and it's you're not just standing there looking out. You're doing an activity, so it's something that a reason to stand there. But then also how the landscaping works beyond that is really important. Considering where the pathways are, considering that kind of buffer space, considering planting or a planter, as part of that buffer space. I think getting that right is really, really tricky, but really valuable and really important, to the success of those spaces.
Of course, perfect. Well, thanks very much, guys.
No bother.
I'm sure everybody enjoyed.
Thanks for inviting us.
So
it's good to come back to my old uni. Like
virtually.
Virtually, yeah. So I was kind of hoping if I ever did give a lecture, I'd have to come back into the Matthew building. It's like just sort of, yeah. So I see the old terrible studios. I
know. So thanks everybody for coming along tonight. So if anybody wants to keep an eye on the social media, we will be announcing our next lecture on Monday, which is with Simon Henley of Henley Hillbrown. So hope to see everybody there. Thanks for coming along tonight.